The courtroom felt colder than winter, colder than any place built for human voices or human mercy. The air smelled faintly of polish, paper, and something older, something heavier, like decisions that had already been made before anyone stepped inside. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale wash across the polished wood benches and the dark mahogany panels that seemed to swallow warmth and hope in equal measure. Every cough echoed. Every shuffle of paper sounded like a verdict being written in permanent ink. She sat alone at the defense table, hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers pressing into each other until the tips burned. The sleeves of her thrift store blazer hung too long over her wrists, making her look smaller, younger, like a girl playing dress-up in a world that demanded armor. Her name was being whispered across the courtroom like a rumor already accepted as truth. Reporters in the back row typed without looking up, their screens glowing like silent judges. Cameras waited outside the doors, ready to capture the face of a criminal the city had already decided existed. To them, she was not a person, she was a headline, a scandal, a lesson about greed. Across the aisle, her stepmother dabbed delicately at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, the movement slow and practiced, like a performance she had rehearsed in front of mirrors. The black designer suit she wore fit her perfectly, sharp lines, perfect tailoring, the uniform of someone who knew exactly how the world worked and how to make it work for her. When she tilted her head just slightly, light caught the diamonds at her ears, sending small flashes across the room like cold stars. To strangers, she looked like grief wrapped in elegance. To the girl sitting at the defense table, she looked like the architect of ruin. The prosecutor's voice filled the space, smooth and controlled, the tone of a man who already believed he was right. He spoke about numbers, about missing funds, about pension accounts drained, about betrayal. Each word landed carefully, deliberately, building a portrait of a monster wearing the face of a 22-year-old girl who used to sketch in coffee shops and worry about student loans. He never looked at her while he spoke. He spoke to the jury, to the press, to the invisible court of public opinion that had already convicted her days ago. The judge watched from above, face unreadable, fingers resting near the gavel like a man holding the weight of gravity itself. When he finally spoke, the room seemed to shrink around his voice. He spoke about flight risk, about seriousness of charges, about responsibility to the law. His eyes moved toward her slowly, like turning toward something fragile that might break under pressure. "Is there anyone here," he asked, "anyone at all who can speak to your character?" The words settled into her chest like stones. She turned in her seat, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She scanned the gallery. Rows of strangers stared back, reporters, curious spectators, people who wanted to see what a fallen rich girl looked like in real life. There were no friends from university, no teachers, no neighbors, no one who remembered the girl who used to stay up late helping classmates study or volunteering at art exhibits for free just to be near something beautiful. Her stepmother met her gaze from the front row. And then, almost invisible to anyone else, the woman gave the smallest shake of her head. Her lips formed one silent word. "Nobody." Something inside her chest cracked open, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet splitting sound that only she could hear. She felt the last thin thread of hope snap loose and drift away. The realization came not as panic, but as a heavy, numb acceptance. This was it. This was the moment where her life narrowed into a hallway with locked doors on both sides and no light at the end. She turned back to face the judge, throat tight, voice barely strong enough to exist. "No, Your Honor." The words felt like signing something permanent, like handing over her future and watching it disappear into someone else's hands. The prosecutor exhaled softly, satisfied. Her stepmother lowered her head, shoulders trembling in a performance of grief that would photograph beautifully. Pens scratched across paper, keys tapped. Somewhere outside, sirens wailed in the distance, the sound bleeding faintly through the courthouse walls like a warning no one inside could hear. The judge lifted the gavel slowly. The wood gleamed under the courtroom lights. She watched it rise, and in that suspended second she let herself imagine prison cells, concrete walls, metal doors closing behind her. She imagined birthdays missed, paintings never finished, a life shrinking into survival instead of living. For the first time since the charges were announced, she stopped fighting inside her own mind. She stopped searching for rescue. She stopped waiting for someone to stand up and say she mattered. Because the world had already decided she didn't. And as the gavel hovered in the air, ready to fall, her stepmother finally looked at her again, not with hatred, not with rage, but with something colder. Victory! And in that moment, she understood something terrifying. This had never been about money. This had always been about erasing her. The gavel never fell. The sound that stopped it was not loud, not explosive, but heavy, slow, deliberate, like fate changing direction. The back doors of the courtroom opened with a long wooden groan that cut through the silence like a blade through cloth. Every head turned at once, not because of fear, but because of something deeper, something instinctive, the way animals sense a predator entering a clearing before they see it. The air shifted. Conversations died mid-breath. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum softer, as if the building itself was holding still. He walked in without rushing, without looking around, moving with the quiet certainty of a man who had never once needed permission to enter any room on earth. His suit was black, perfectly cut, the fabric absorbing light instead of reflecting it. His hair was streaked with silver at the temples, not aging him but sharpening him, like a weapon that had only grown more precise over time. Two men followed several steps behind him, but they were shadows compared to the gravity he carried. He walked straight down the center aisle, shoes striking the polished floor in slow, measured rhythm that echoed louder than it should have. People moved without being asked. Knees shifted, bodies leaned away. A reporter lowered her camera without realizing she had done it. The court officer reached for his belt but did not draw anything, because some part of him understood that whatever authority he thought he had did not apply to the man now walking toward the defense table. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to pull control back into his hands, but his voice came out thinner than before. "Sir, this is a restricted proceeding. You cannot simply enter." The man did not stop immediately. He took 3 more steps, then stopped directly behind her chair. She felt him before she saw him, felt the presence like standing too close to a storm cloud charged with lightning. He smelled faintly of leather and smoke and something expensive she could not name. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and carried through the courtroom without effort. "Forgive the interruption, Your Honor, but I believe you asked if there was anyone who could speak for the young woman." The prosecutor straightened, anger flashing across his face, but it was swallowed quickly by uncertainty. The stepmother stiffened in her seat, fingers tightening around her handkerchief so hard the silk twisted. The judge leaned forward, studying the man with new caution. "And you are?" The man reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed a card, handing it to the bailiff without looking away from the judge. The bailiff walked it forward. The judge read it. His expression changed in a way he could not hide. His back straightened. The room filled with the sound of whispers spreading like wildfire. Some of the reporters had already pulled out phones, typing frantically, eyes wide. The man finally placed one hand gently on her shoulder. The contact was warm, steady, grounding, like something solid in a world that had been slipping away from her for months. She froze, heart pounding so violently she thought everyone must hear it. She had never met him. She was sure of that, but his touch carried familiarity, not of memory, but of something older, something that lived in blood and bone. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I am not here as a spectator. I am here because the defendant is not alone." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like the entire room was leaning toward him. The stepmother stood suddenly, voice sharp and shaking with forced outrage. "This is absurd. Who is this man?" The stranger turned his head slightly toward her, and he did not glare, did not raise his voice, did not move aggressively. He simply looked at her, and something in his eyes made her sit down again without finishing the sentence. The judge swallowed once before speaking. "Mr. Morty, is it?" "Yes," the man answered. "Alessandro Morty." The name landed like a dropped weapon. Even the prosecutor stepped back slightly as recognition spread across the courtroom like a shockwave. Stories about him lived in financial news and police briefings and whispers in government halls. He was power without a public face. He was influence that never needed a signature. He was the kind of man people pretended did not exist while rearranging their lives around his decisions. The judge cleared his throat again. "And your interest in this case, Mr. Morty?" The man's hand remained on her shoulder, firm and protective. His answer came without hesitation. "She is my daughter." The silence that followed felt like oxygen had been pulled from the room. The stepmother made a broken sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp. The prosecutor stared as if someone had just rewritten reality in front of him. She slowly turned in her chair, looking up at the man who had just shattered the world she thought she understood. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since her father died, she saw something she had forgotten existed. Protection. Not pity, not control, protection. He spoke softer now, only for her. "You were never alone." And in that moment, the girl who had been ready to disappear realized the story of her life had just been ripped open, and whatever came next was going to be far more dangerous than prison. The word daughter did not settle gently into the courtroom, it detonated silently inside every person who heard it. For her, it felt like gravity had shifted sideways, pulling memories loose from places she had buried them. The man standing beside her did not look away from her face, and there was no hesitation in his expression, only certainty, only recognition, only something ancient and immovable, like he had been waiting for this moment longer than she had been alive. The judge adjusted his glasses again, but his hand was no longer steady. The prosecutor flipped through his files like paper might save him from something he could not control. In the gallery, phones were already glowing, reporters whispering names into microphones, hands shaking as news moved faster than facts. But she heard none of it because her mind was trapped on one impossible thought. If he was telling the truth, then her entire life had been a constructed lie built carefully around her like invisible walls. The man removed his hand from her shoulder only long enough to gesture toward the doors. They opened again, and this time 3 people entered carrying thin lock document cases, the kind used for diplomatic transport. They did not look like ordinary lawyers. They looked like people who dismantled governments quietly. They walked forward without asking permission and placed the cases on the prosecution table before stepping back. The judge did not object. He simply watched as the man beside her spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying something colder beneath it. "Your Honor, these documents contain certified birth records, international trust filings, and verified genetic authentication processed less than 12 hours ago." The prosecutor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The judge nodded slowly to the bailiff, who carried the first file forward like it weighed far more than paper should. The room was silent except for the sound of pages turning, and each page seemed to carve deeper lines into the judge's face. Across the room, her stepmother had gone completely still, not shocked, not confused, but calculating. Her eyes were not on the documents, they were on the man standing beside her, and there was real fear there now, the kind that comes when someone realizes they misjudged the size of the enemy. The judge finally spoke, his voice lower than before, like he was suddenly aware history might be listening. "According to these records," he said carefully, "the defendant is listed as primary heir and controlling beneficiary of a private asset structure that appears to hold majority ownership in the company from which the alleged funds were stolen." The words hung there heavy and undeniable. A ripple of sound moved through the gallery like wind through tall grass. She felt her heartbeat climb into her throat. If she owned the company, then the crime could not exist. If the crime could not exist, then everything done to her had been deliberate. The man beside her spoke again, this time directly to the judge. "She cannot steal what was always hers." The prosecutor's hands were trembling now. The judge leaned back slowly like the room had tilted beneath him. The stepmother stood suddenly, her voice cracking with something wild. "This is fabricated, this is manipulation, this is some performance designed to intimidate this court." The man turned toward her fully now, and for the first time the calm in his expression shifted, revealing something dangerous beneath it, something that belonged to a world far outside courtrooms and laws. He did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply spoke quietly, and somehow that was worse. You wanted her destroyed for a number that would not cover 1 week of my operational fuel costs. Now you will watch everything you tried to steal collapse around you. The judge struck the gavel once, not to end the chaos but to contain it. Bail is granted, he said firmly, pending full verification of submitted evidence. The sound of cameras outside the courtroom had already started building like distant thunder. She felt her knees weaken as reality rewrote itself around her. The man reached for her arm, steadying her easily like he had done it 1,000 times before. As he guided her toward the exit, the crowd parted without being told. Questions exploded around them, but he ignored every one of them until they reached the courthouse doors, where sunlight flooded over them, blinding and unreal. Black armored vehicles waited at the curb, engines already running. She stopped before stepping inside, turning toward him, finally forcing the question out of her chest. Why now? His eyes softened in a way that did not match the power radiating from him. Because the people who tried to erase you have stopped hiding. And by stepping into the light, I have just told them exactly where to aim. The city outside the courthouse looked the same as it always had: glass towers cutting into the sky, traffic lights blinking with mechanical indifference, people rushing past like survival itself was a timed competition. But inside the armored vehicle, the world felt smaller, tighter, like the air itself knew something violent had just shifted. She sat pressed against the leather seat, hands locked together, trying to steady the tremor that would not leave her fingers. Across from her, Alessandro Morty sat in complete stillness, eyes fixed on the tinted window like he was reading threats written into the reflection of passing buildings. No one spoke for several minutes. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with calculations, with contingency plans, with invisible war maps being redrawn second by second. Finally he spoke without looking at her. The woman who raised you is not the architect of this. The words landed slowly, forcing her mind to chase them. She swallowed once, forcing her voice to exist. Then who is? He turned toward her, and for the first time she saw exhaustion behind the power, not weakness, but the weight of a man who had been fighting enemies long before she was born. There are organizations that do not exist on paper, he said quietly. They do not build companies, they do not build cities, they build leverage. Your stepmother borrowed money from one of them years ago, gambling debts, luxury investments. When she could not repay, they offered her a solution. Deliver control of the Mercer infrastructure and her debt disappears. She felt cold crawl across her spine. They wanted the company. He shook his head slowly. They wanted the access routes, the transport networks, the shell corridors hidden inside the company structure. He paused, then added something that made the air feel thinner. And when they discovered you were connected to me, you became far more valuable than any company. The vehicle turned sharply, entering an underground ramp leading into a private secured structure. Armed guards stood at every checkpoint, not in uniforms, but in tailored suits, carrying the kind of posture that came from military pasts, not private security training. The car stopped inside a concrete chamber that looked more like a fortified bunker than a parking garage. As the doors opened, she realized her world had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He stepped out first, scanning every shadow before offering his hand to help her out. "Stay close to me," he said, not as a suggestion but as a law of survival. They moved toward a private elevator, doors already open, waiting for them like the building itself obeyed him. Inside the lift, the silence returned until the doors sealed and the elevator shot upward so fast her ears popped. When the doors opened again, the space waiting for them was vast, and cold glass walls revealing the city below like something fragile and disposable. He walked to a long table covered in digital screens, each one showing maps, financial feeds, shipping lanes, satellite surveillance feeds she could not fully understand. "This is what they want," he said simply. "Control of these networks means control of half the supply movement between continents." She stared at the screens, trying to connect this impossible scale to the life she had been living only days ago. "Why me?" she asked, finally, her voice quieter, now not angry, just raw. "Because you were never supposed to be visible," he said. "Your mother died because my enemies wanted to send a message. I hid you with a man I trusted more than my own blood. I built a life around you that looked ordinary enough to keep predators bored, but when Robert died, the shield broke. Your stepmother thought you were weak enough to sacrifice. The people behind her saw an opportunity. Frame you, remove you, and use your identity to take control legally. Her chest tightened, so the trial was never about money. He shook his head once. It was phase 1. Phase 2 would have been disappearance. The word hung in the air like poison. She felt anger rise fast and hot, burning through fear. I am not disappearing, she said before she could stop herself. Something almost like pride moved through his expression. No, he said quietly, you are not, but understand this. By claiming you publicly today, I have declared war on people who have spent decades perfecting how to destroy families, governments, and empires without leaving fingerprints. He stepped closer, now lowering his voice. And they will not come at us through courts again. They will come through fear, through leverage, through blood. Outside the glass walls, the city lights began turning on one by one like distant warning fires. For the first time, she understood that prison had never been the worst thing waiting for her. The real danger had only just learned her name. Night settled over the city like a living thing pressing against the glass walls of the penthouse until the skyline looked less like civilization and more like a battlefield waiting for its first explosion. She stood near the window, staring down at streets that once felt normal and now felt distant, like she was looking at a life that had belonged to someone else. The apartment behind her was silent in a way that felt unnatural. No television noise, no city echo, no human mess, only controlled stillness and the faint electronic pulse of machines hidden inside the walls. Somewhere deeper in the resident security systems breathed quietly, tracking movement, measuring heat signatures, mapping threat probabilities in real time. This was not a home. This was a command center disguised as luxury. Alessandro Morti stood across the room near a long black console, studying multiple digital feeds projected into the air in front of him. Shipping corridors flickered beside financial data, and satellite imaging overlays moved slowly across oceans like silent ghosts. His face looked carved from stone in the pale blue glow, but his eyes moved constantly, calculating, measuring risk, predicting violence before it could take shape. Without looking at her, he spoke quietly. Sit. She obeyed without thinking, lowering herself onto the white leather chair across from him, feeling small and strangely exposed despite the fortress around her. He tapped the screen once and the feeds vanished, replaced by an old photograph scanned into digital clarity. A woman smiled out from the image, dark hair loose around her shoulders, eyes alive with something warm and fearless. Your mother, he said simply. The word struck deeper than she expected. She leaned forward, staring at the face, trying to find pieces of herself hidden inside the stranger's smile. He walked closer and sat across from her, something in his posture softer, now less like a ruler and more like a man standing near a wound he had never allowed to heal. She was not supposed to die, he said quietly. The night she died, I was supposed to be driving that car. She took it instead because she wanted to pick up groceries and surprise me with dinner. He paused once, breathing slowly before continuing. The brakes failed halfway down a mountain road. The car flipped 3 times. You were 6 months old in the back seat. You survived without a scratch. The silence that followed felt sacred and unbearable at the same time. Her chest tightened, imagining a life she never remembered, a woman she never got to know, and a war she had been born into without consent. He stood suddenly, walking toward the glass wall, staring out at the city like it was an enemy he had memorized street by street. After the funeral, I received a message, he said. Next time we do not miss the child. The words hung heavy and violent. She felt cold slide through her veins, understanding blooming slowly like poison. That is why you hid me, she said. He nodded once. I built false records. I moved money through 10 countries. I gave you to a man who would have died before letting harm reach you. I watched from distance, every report card, every medical record, every photo. I did not stay away because I did not care. I stayed away because if they knew you were mine, you would never have made it to adulthood. Her throat burned, anger tried to rise, but grief drowned it before it could form. All those years, she whispered, thinking I was nothing. He turned back toward her, and for the first time she saw something break through his composure. I needed you invisible, he said. Invisible children survive wars they never know exist. But when Robert died and your stepmother started moving money in patterns, I recognized I knew someone else had found you. the room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved closer. He walked back toward the console, tapping commands until a new set of screens appeared showing surveillance, stills, financial transactions, faces she did not recognize but somehow knew were dangerous. The organization behind her, he said, controls private armies, corporate shells, and political leverage across 3 continents. They do not chase money, they chase control points. You are now the biggest control point they have ever seen exposed. Her hands trembled, but she forced them, still pressing them into her knees. What happens now? She asked. He studied her carefully, like measuring something beyond fear. Now you learn who you really are, he said, not the girl they tried to erase, not the student who apologized for existing. You are my daughter. You are the future of an empire built in blood and strategy and survival. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. And tomorrow they will test whether you are strong enough to survive what is coming. Outside the glass, the city lights flickered, endlessly alive and fragile, and unaware that somewhere high above them, a war had already begun, and she was standing directly at the center of it. Morning light flooded the penthouse in sheets of gold that looked beautiful but felt deceptive, like something pretending to be safe. She woke slowly, disoriented by the silence, by the size of the room, by the unfamiliar softness of the bed beneath her. For a few seconds she forgot everything. Then memory returned all at once. Courtroom doors, bloodlines, war threats, and the quiet certainty in Alessandro Morti's voice when he said the world would come for her now. She sat up, breathing slowly, forcing her thoughts to line up into something usable. On the table beside the bed, a tray weighted, untouched breakfast perfectly arranged beside a tablet device locked into a private network. The message on the screen was simple: do not leave the building. Training begins at noon. The words felt less like protection and more like containment. She stood walking toward the massive glass windows, staring down at the city that used to belong to everyone and now felt like territory divided into invisible danger zones. The longer she stood there, the heavier the feeling grew that something of her old life was slipping away forever. Then one thought cut through everything, sharp and urgent. Her storage locker, the sketchbooks, the only proof she had ever existed outside of money and bloodlines and violence. Panic rose fast. If the enemies watching her wanted to erase her, they would not just target her body, they would erase her history. Her art was the only place she had ever been honest, the only place she had ever been safe. She turned, scanning the room, calculating distance to the door, listening for movement outside. Guards' voices drifted faintly from the hallway, relaxed, distracted human. She moved quickly, dressing in the same clothes from the courthouse, ignoring the designer wardrobe waiting untouched. She grabbed the service key card left beside the breakfast tray, heart pounding so loudly she was sure security systems would hear it. The service elevator ride down felt endless, each floor number flashing like a countdown to something irreversible. When the doors opened into the lower staff corridor, no one stopped her. She walked through the loading exit into open morning air, and the city noise hit her like proof she still belonged somewhere normal. She walked 2 blocks before hailing a cab, forcing herself not to look behind her. As the cab pulled into traffic, she missed the dark sedan sliding smoothly into motion 2 cars back, blending perfectly into the morning rush. The ride felt too long and too short at the same time, her pulse racing with every turn, every stoplight, every shadow in the rearview mirror. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself she just needed 20 minutes to grab the portfolio and leave. But the feeling in her chest kept growing, like something already knew she had made a mistake. The storage facility sat between abandoned warehouses and auto shops, chain link fences rattling slightly in the wind. She paid the driver, stepped out, and walked quickly, punching in the entry code with shaking fingers. The metal door rolled up, revealing plastic bins stacked exactly where she had left them, like a frozen version of her old life waiting patiently. Relief hit so fast it almost made her dizzy. She rushed forward, grabbing the black portfolio case, pulling it to her chest like it was oxygen. Then a voice spoke from behind her, smooth, calm, and completely wrong for a place like this. Sentimental attachments always create leverage. She spun around and saw a man standing in the doorway, perfectly dressed, completely still, eyes cold in a way that felt practiced, not emotional. 2 larger men stood behind him, blocking the exit like walls that could move. Her throat went dry. "Who are you?" she forced out. The man smiled slightly, but it never reached his eyes. Someone who knows exactly how valuable you are now. She moved fast, lunging sideways, trying to slip past the bigger men, but one grabbed her arm, twisting hard enough to make her cry out. The man stepped closer, pulling a syringe from inside his jacket, holding it casually like he had done this 100 times. "This will make things easier," he said quietly. Panic exploded through her veins. She kicked hard, connecting with his leg, but his grip tightened, pulling her closer. One of the men grabbed her shoulders, forcing her still. The needle moved closer to her neck, and she realized this was it, not a courtroom, not a trial, just disappearance into a van, into nothing. Then an engine roared, suddenly impossibly loud, inside the enclosed storage lane. A black motorcycle shot around the corner, tires screaming against concrete, heading straight toward them without slowing. The man cursed, stepping back just as the bike slammed into one of the guards, sending him crashing into the metal wall. The rider launched off the bike, rolling across the ground, then rising instantly like gravity barely affected him. He wore a full helmet, dark visor hiding everything except pure forward focus. The second guard charged him, and the rider moved like water, stepping inside the attack, dropping him with 2 brutal, precise strikes. The suited man reached for a gun, but something metal spun through the air, striking his wrist, sending the weapon clattering across the concrete. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. The rider grabbed her arm, pulling her behind him, voice rough through the helmet, "Stay behind me." The suited man backed toward the exit, eyes burning with fury. "This is not finished," he said before running for the waiting sedan outside. The remaining guards stumbled after him, and the car peeled away just as black armored vehicles screamed into the lot. She collapsed against the storage wall, shaking uncontrollably as the rider turned, pulling off his helmet, revealing a young man, face bruised, eyes sharp and intensely focused. He looked at her like he had known her longer than this moment. "You should not have come alone," he said, breathing hard. Somewhere behind them, car doors slammed, and she heard Alessandro Morty shouting her name for the first time, not like a king commanding, but like a father who had almost lost everything again. The penthouse no longer felt like a place where someone lived, it felt like a place where wars were planned long before anyone admitted they had started. By the time they returned that afternoon, the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations were quieter, movements were faster, screens glowed with constant updates, and new faces moved through the space, speaking in low, controlled tones that carried the weight of urgency. She stepped inside, still shaken from the storage facility, her body remembering the feeling of the needle inches from her skin, the sound of the motorcycle tearing through concrete silence, the certainty that if she had been 10 seconds slower, she would have disappeared without a trace. Alessandro Morty stood near the center of the main living space, surrounded by 3 advisors and 2 security captains, but when he saw her, he dismissed everyone with a single look. When he reached her, his hands settled briefly on her shoulders, checking for injuries, checking for reality, like he needed to confirm she was still there. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled, but underneath it was something raw. "You do not leave this building again without clearance. Not because I want to control you, but because they will not make the same mistake twice." She nodded, but something inside her had already shifted. Fear was still there, but it was different now, less like drowning and more like standing in cold water, refusing to move. He studied her face carefully, then nodded once as if reaching a decision. "Good," he said quietly. "Then we stop treating you like something that needs to be hidden. We prepare you like something that needs to survive." Within an hour, the penthouse transformed into something she would never have believed existed. A woman arrived first, elegant, sharp-eyed, introducing herself as a communications strategist who specialized in shaping public perception during international crises. Then a former intelligence analyst arrived carrying encrypted tablets filled with profiles of people she would soon need to recognize instantly. Then a security instructor, former special forces, walked in with training cases and the posture of someone who measured rooms by exit routes and firing angles. It felt overwhelming, but also strangely grounding, like every person here already believed she belonged in this world, even if she did not believe it yet. They started with information because knowledge, he said, is the only weapon that cannot be taken from you. She learned how money moved invisibly between governments and corporations, how shell companies created ghost identities for real assets, how rival syndicates used legal systems as weapons long before violence became necessary. Every fact made her chest tighter but also clearer. This was the world that had been circling her entire life, waiting for her to become visible. By evening, the training shifted. The security instructor placed a small device on the table and asked her to identify the safest exit route from a simulated ambush scenario. She failed the first time. The second time, she noticed the reflection of a window she had missed. The third time, she chose correctly. Something small but important sparked inside her, not confidence, not yet, but awareness. Later, they practiced situational breathing, controlling pulse, controlling visible fear, controlling the way eyes move when someone is lying to you. It was exhausting but addictive in a way she did not expect. Near midnight, she stood alone in front of a mirror, wearing a tailored dark dress chosen not for beauty but for authority. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The girl who once worried about rent and art supplies still existed somewhere inside, but she was being layered over with something harder, sharper, more deliberate. The door opened quietly and the young man from the storage facility stepped inside, now cleaned up, dressed in a simple black suit that still could not hide the way he moved, like someone trained for chaos. He stopped a few steps behind her. "You look different," he said softly. She met his reflection in the mirror. "I feel different," she answered honestly. He nodded once, like he understood more than she said. "Your father asked me to stay," he said. "Officially security. Unofficially someone who understands how enemies think." She turned, slightly studying him more carefully now. "Why did you follow me that day?" she asked. He hesitated, then answered simply, "Because you looked like someone who had no idea how dangerous the world around her really was, and I knew if I was right I would not forgive myself for ignoring it." Later, Alessandro Morty stood beside her, looking out over the night skyline, lights stretching endlessly like a map of choices and consequences. "Tomorrow night," he said, "is the Foundation Gala. Every major political and financial power in this city will be there, and so will representatives of the people who tried to take you today." She felt her pulse quicken, but she did not look away from the glass. "And you want me there," she said. "I need you there," he corrected quietly. "Because tomorrow is not about charity or business. Tomorrow is where you stop being the girl they tried to erase and become the woman they will have to learn to fear." Somewhere deep in the city, far below, men she had never met were already planning how to break her, and for the first time she did not feel like prey waiting to be hunted. She felt like something learning how to hunt back. The night of the gala did not feel like an event, it felt like a countdown. From the moment the sun disappeared behind the skyline, the city lights came alive one by one, like signals being sent across invisible battle lines. Inside the penthouse, everything moved with quiet precision. Stylists worked in silence, choosing fabrics that communicated authority without needing to shout. Security teams rotated through final briefings, mapping exits, blind corners, sight lines, and threat zones. Alessandro Morty stood near the window, dressed in a black suit, so perfectly tailored it looked like armor shaped into elegance. When she stepped out of the dressing room, the entire room paused for a fraction of a second, not because of beauty, but because of presence. The midnight blue velvet dress absorbed light and shadow at the same time, and the silver locket rested at the center of her collarbone like a reminder of the life she had survived. She did not look like a girl being introduced to power. She looked like someone who had been born for it and was only now being returned to it. The drive to the museum felt longer than it was because every passing street felt like a possible ambush point. Every shadow felt like a decision someone else had already made. The black convoy moved through traffic like a single organism, engines' quiet movements controlled and deliberate. When they pulled onto the red carpet, the sound hit instantly. Cameras, voices, shouted questions, flashing lights, turning night into artificial day. She stepped out beside Alessandro Morty and felt the weight of thousands of eyes measuring her, deciding what she was worth, deciding whether she was threat or target. She kept her chin-level, shoulders steady, moving forward without hesitation. Inside the grand hall, the noise softened into expensive laughter, crystal glasses, low political conversations, and the silent, measuring looks of people who understood power when they saw it. Marble floors reflected golden light across suits and gowns, and priceless artifacts stood in glass cases like silent witnesses to centuries of ambition and conquest. Then she saw them. Across the hall near a sculpture display, her stepmother stood wearing silver instead of black tonight, like she was trying to reinvent herself into something untouchable. Beside her stood a man she had only seen in surveillance files but recognized instantly. Tall blonde hair, slicked back, eyes too empty to belong to someone capable of empathy. Sebastian Cross lifted his glass slightly toward her in a mocking greeting, like they were sharing a private joke. Her pulse jumped, but she did not break stride. In her ear, the quiet voice of security spoke calm and controlled. "He is here earlier than expected. Stay on path." Alessandro guided her toward the stage area where the foundation announcement would be made, and as they walked she could feel the room adjusting, conversations lowering, curiosity sharpening. This was no longer just a charity night. This was theater. This was strategy performed under chandeliers. When Alessandro stepped to the microphone, the room slowly quieted. He spoke about legacy, about rebuilding infrastructure, about future energy corridors, but she barely heard the words because Sebastian Cross was watching her with the patience of someone who had never lost a game he truly cared about. Then Alessandro turned slightly toward her, signaling it was time. She stepped forward, heart steady, breathing controlled, remembering every lesson from the last 24 hours. The speech waiting on the teleprompter was safe, controlled, forgettable. She stared at it for 2 seconds, then looked up instead, directly into the crowd. "My father speaks about legacy," she said, her voice carrying farther than she expected. "But legacy is not built from silence. It is built from truth." The room shifted instantly, curiosity turning into alertness. "For 2 years I was told I was nothing," she continued. "I was told I was disposable. But the people who tried to erase me made one mistake. They believed I would stay quiet." She turned fully now, locking eyes with Sebastian Cross across the hall. "You sent men to take me this morning," she said clearly. "You used financial systems to frame me. You killed my mother because she stood in your way." The sound that followed was not shouting, it was shock. Dozens of conversations collapsing into stunned silence. Cameras turned, security teams moved subtly into position. Sebastian Cross' smile vanished, replaced by something raw and furious. Alessandro Morti stepped slightly forward, ready to cut power to the speech, but she did not stop. "I am not prey," she said, her voice rising not with fear but with certainty. "I am not leverage, and tonight you learn what happens when you fail to finish what you start." Then everything broke. Cross moved faster than anyone expected, reaching inside his jacket, pulling a gun with the smoothness of someone who had done it many times before. Screams exploded across the hall, people diving behind tables, glass shattering somewhere behind her. She saw the barrel lift, pointing directly at her chest, and time slowed into something thick and heavy. She heard someone shout her name, but the sound felt distant. The gun fired and the sound cracked through the hall like the sky splitting open. She braced for impact, but instead something slammed into her, knocking her backward onto the stage floor. The air left her lungs as she hit the marble, and for 1 second she saw nothing but ceiling lights spinning above her. Then she realized someone was on top of her, heavy, unmoving. She pushed up and saw red spreading across a white shirt. The young man from the storage facility stared at her, trying to smile even as blood filled his mouth. "Told you," he whispered, barely audible. "I would not let them touch you." Somewhere around them, security tackled Cross, dragging him to the floor, but she barely saw it because the world had narrowed to the sound of her own heartbeat and the terrible realization that power always demands a price, and tonight someone had paid it for her. The hospital did not feel like a place where people healed, it felt like a place where time was forced to slow down so reality could catch up with trauma. The waiting area lights were too bright, the air smelled too clean, and every small sound felt amplified. Footsteps, doors opening, distant voices speaking in low, urgent tones. She sat in a plastic chair, still wearing the dark velvet dress now stained with dried blood that was not hers. She refused to change. She refused to move. If she moved, it would mean this was real, and if it was real, then the moment on that marble floor would replay forever. Across from her Alessandro, Morty stood near the window phone pressed to his ear, speaking in three languages switching between them like weapons, but his eyes kept drifting back to her making sure she was still sitting, still breathing, still present. Minutes blurred into something shapeless. Doctors walked past nurses, whispered monitors beeped somewhere behind double doors, and every time the doors swung open her heart slammed painfully against her ribs. She replayed the moment over and over, the gun, the sound, the weight of his body hitting hers, the shock in his eyes, not fear, but relief, like he had finished something important. She pressed her palms together so tightly her fingers turned white. She had known him for days, not years, but he had stepped in front of death like it was a decision he had already made long before the gala. Finally, the double doors opened and a surgeon stepped out, mask hanging around his neck, eyes tired but focused. Alessandro crossed the room in 2 steps but did not speak, first letting the man deliver the verdict like it was a battlefield report. The bullet missed the heart by less than 2 centimeters, the surgeon said quietly. It collapsed part of the lung, but we repaired the damage. He lost a lot of blood, but he is stable. Stable. The word cracked something inside her chest, and suddenly she was breathing again, air rushing back into lungs she did not realize she had stopped using. She closed her eyes once, feeling tears slide silently down her face, relief mixing with something deeper, something she did not want to name yet. Hours later, she stood outside the recovery room, staring through the glass at the machines surrounding him, wires, lines, monitors, translating life into numbers and blinking lights. He looked smaller somehow, without movement, without the sharp focus that made him seem unbreakable. She stepped inside slowly, the door closing with a soft seal behind her. The room smelled like antiseptic and electricity and the faint metallic scent of blood. She moved to the side of the bed, sitting carefully like sudden movement might break him. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to light, and for a second confusion crossed his face before recognition settled in. "You look terrible," he whispered, voice rough and thin. She let out a broken laugh that sounded half like crying. "You took a bullet," she said. "You do not get to critique my appearance." He tried to smile but winced slightly. "Worth it," he said simply. The words hit harder than anything else had that night. She reached for his hand, feeling how warm it was, how human, how real. "Why?" she asked, finally, voice barely steady. "You barely know me." He watched her for a long moment, like choosing which truth to give her. "Because you looked like someone who spent too long thinking she was disposable," he said quietly. "And I know what happens to people like that when the wrong enemies find them." Something inside her chest shifted again, deeper this time, heavier. She realized this was not obligation, not employment, not loyalty bought with money. This was choice, pure dangerous choice. Later, when she stepped back into the hallway, Alessandro stood waiting, arms crossed, expression unreadable but his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "He will live," he said simply. She nodded, once unable to speak yet. He studied her carefully, then spoke quieter. "Power will always demand sacrifice," he said. "Tonight it almost demanded you. Instead it took someone who chose to stand in front of it." She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Then I will make sure it was not for nothing," she said. For the first time since she met him, Alessandro Morty looked at her, not like someone he needed to protect, but like someone he believed could stand beside him. Somewhere deep in the city, investigators were already tearing apart the networks behind Sebastian. Cross and empires were already beginning to shift quietly, but inside that hospital hallway something far more dangerous had been born. She was no longer the girl who survived because someone hid her. She was becoming the woman who would decide who survived next. The boardroom sat high above the city, wrapped in glass and silence, like a throne room pretending to be a business space. Morning light poured across the long black table, reflecting off polished surfaces and turning every chair into a waiting witness. The men seated along the sides of the table spoke quietly to each other but stopped the moment the main doors opened. They expected Alessandro Morty to walk in. They expected the man who had built an empire through precision and fear and patience. Instead, she stepped through the doorway alone. The sound of her heels against the marble floor carried across the room, slow, controlled, deliberate. She wore white not as softness but as contrast, a clean, sharp declaration that she was not stepping into power quietly. Conversations died instantly. 20 pairs of eyes studied her, measuring, calculating, questioning whether this was temporary or permanent. She reached the head of the table and rested her hands against the back of the chair without sitting. The city skyline burned behind her in reflected light, making her look almost carved out of the morning itself. "My father will not be joining us," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the room without effort. "He has stepped away from operational leadership." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief and fear because every person in that room understood what those words really meant. She was not here representing him. She was here replacing him. Some of them shifted slightly, others remained perfectly still, hiding reactions behind decades of discipline. She picked up the small remote on the table and activated the wall display behind her. Financial structures appeared first, then territory maps, then something new: energy infrastructure expansion plans tied directly to global transport routes. "For years this organization survived by controlling movement," she said calmly. "Now we evolve by controlling what powers that movement. Renewable corridors, smart infrastructure, humanitarian supply protection." The words felt almost too clean for a room built on shadows, but she did not hesitate. "Fear builds empires," she continued, "but stability keeps them alive." One of the older council members leaned forward, finally breaking the silence. "And if the old enemies return?" he asked carefully. She held his gaze without blinking. "Then they learn we are not what we were 20 years ago. We are stronger because we do not hide behind fear anymore." She tapped the remote again and new files appeared: evidence chains, asset seizures, frozen accounts, shell networks collapsing one by one. "The organization behind Sebastian Cross is already fracturing," she said. "Their investors are turning on each other. Their leverage is gone." The room shifted, this time not with doubt but with realization. She was not guessing. She was already moving pieces they did not know existed. The doors behind them opened quietly and Alessandro Morti stepped in, not walking to the head of the table, not interrupting, simply standing against the glass wall watching. He said nothing, and that silence meant more than any speech. It meant approval. It meant transfer of power. It meant this was real. She continued without looking back because she did not need confirmation anymore. "This empire will not be remembered for what it destroyed," she said. "It will be remembered for what it protected. Trade routes that cannot be hijacked, cities that cannot be starved, systems that cannot be corrupted from the inside. If anyone in this room believes that makes us weaker, you are free to leave." No one moved, not one chair shifted. The message was understood. Hours later, she stood alone on the rooftop, overlooking the endless spread of the city, wind pulling gently at her hair. The door behind her opened, and she did not turn because she already knew who it was. He moved beside her, slower now, still recovering but stubborn enough to be standing. "You look like someone who just rewrote history," he said quietly. She exhaled slowly, watching traffic move like rivers of light below them. "I just decided I was done letting other people write," she answered. He leaned against the railing beside her. "You know they will keep coming," he said. She nodded once. "Then they will keep losing," she replied simply. Behind them, inside the tower, the new structure of an empire was already shifting, already adapting, already becoming something the old world would not recognize. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel like something small trying to survive inside it. She felt like something that belonged there, something powerful enough to change it. And somewhere far away, men who had once believed she was easy prey were learning a final lesson. The most dangerous leaders are not the ones born into power. They are the ones who were forced to survive without it and decided to claim it anyway.